Adobe's software subscriptions are almost a meme at this point, but it's been bugging me to do some research and see if my take, that I'm saving money with it, is based on data or if I'm just becoming a cranky old man. To the maths. Among other software, I use Adobe Photoshop and Lightroom to work with my images. I pay Adobe $9.99 each month for the privilege to do this with the Adobe photography plan. Now, it seems like almost every conversation about photography software includes somebody griping about the Adobe subscription fees. I can't really go a week, it seems like, without reading an article on Petapixel or DP Review without the author sniping in Adobe's direction about the monthly subscription costs. Was I better off without the subscription? Would I be saving money if there'd been an alternate course of history and Adobe was still selling software the old way, where we'd buy it outright and then we'd pay an upgrade fee when there was a new release that we wanted? Let's find out. Let's step into an alternate reality where that continued. Let's imagine that we're a old, wise photographer wizard who might have enjoyed such a reality. So as a side note, for this bit of research, we're going to completely ignore the fact that in 2024, almost every other major piece of software is sold as a subscription. Let's dive into the data with our friend, the spreadsheet. Now, we can't quite compare apples to apples because Photoshop and Lightroom were sold as two separate applications in the past. It wasn't a bundle. And now most photographers who are using both of these are going to use the Adobe photography plan that includes both Photoshop and Lightroom for one combined price. But let's break down the data by application at first using the old pricing model, and then we'll do a comparison to see how that might play out compared to the subscription bundle, because whether it's separate or together, dollars are dollars. Let's start with Photoshop. The last version of Photoshop that was available as a standalone, non-subscription purchase was Photoshop CS6 in 2012. Now, to get a picture of what the pricing might look like if it had stayed with the old model, I looked at pricing data that went back as far as the year 2000. Now, if you're trying to make comparisons older than that, you are literally living in the last century. And we're almost a quarter of the way through the current century, so even our old photographer wizard friend is trying to live in the now. In 2000, that was back like Photoshop 6. And what we saw between 2000 and 2013, when everything switched to a Creative Cloud subscription, is that there was a new major version of Photoshop about every 18 months. There were 9 major releases from 2000 until June 2013, when Photoshop CC replaced Photoshop CS6. And whereas Photoshop CS6 could be purchased for that one-time cost, Photoshop CC was the first version of Photoshop that was only available with a Creative Cloud subscription. So if I look at prices, even back in 2000, at the turn of the century, the full version of Photoshop was over $600. That crept up a bit, and then for the last few releases, pricing was consistent, with the full price version of Photoshop being $699, and the upgrade price being $199. So let's use those prices for forecasting. And since Adobe has been nice and hasn't raised the price of the $9.99 photography plan in the entire time that it existed, our photographer wizard friend is going to be pretty excited that we'll play along with a similar reality where the price of Photoshop also wouldn't have gone up over that entire period if they'd kept the old pricing model. So what might that look like if we project that out? Well, if we assume there'd be a new release every 18 months, as there had in the past, this is what the hypothetical release schedule might look like. Along with the costs, we end up with 8 Photoshop releases after Photoshop CS6, and the last one hypothetically would have happened in late 2023. If we'd bought Photoshop for $699, and then paid for those upgrades at $199 each, with the old model, we would have spent a total of $2,291. That period of time is 11 and a half years, 138 months. At $9.99 a month for the Adobe photography plan, over that same period of time, we've spent $1,378.62. It's $912 less with the monthly subscription pricing. maybe this subscription thing isn't quite as terrible as many make it out to be. Let's go take a look at Lightroom and add that into the mix. So when it comes to Lightroom, the first version of Lightroom was in 2007. And what you'll see is you look at the prices of Lightroom version 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, is that like Photoshop, there was a release about every year and a half. The price actually went down for Lightroom a little bit at one point. It's interesting if we look at that time frame. This is when kind of the App Store economy is taking hold. And for better or for worse, that definitely has led to a decrease in software prices overall. Couple that with Adobe figuring out where Lightroom really sat in the market, and we see that for those last few releases of Lightroom, it ended up being $149 for the full version and $79 for the upgrade version. So we'll use those numbers of the last few versions for our carry forward prices. And again, our alternate fantasy photography wizard guy is going to assume those prices aren't going to go up as we project those forward. So if we'd bought Lightroom for $149 and then paid for upgrades as they might have happened over the last 11 years or whatever, we'd have spent $623. Now, I'll note that Lightroom went subscription only a couple of years later than Photoshop, so there's actually less upgrades in here than there were for Photoshop over that same period of time. But either way, that's where we land. Let's add those in to the overall numbers. So with the previous buy new once and then pay for upgrades model, we would have spent a total of $2,914 for Photoshop and Lightroom since 2013. The subscription over that same period, same number here because it's a combined fee, $1,378.62. That's a $1,535.38 difference. The subscription is less than half the cost of the old pricing model. Now, I know some of you are sitting there and you're probably just like vibrating in your seats, waiting to argue with me about something here. So go ahead and get those commenting fingers ready. But before you start rage typing, let's look at a couple of the other objections that people will raise to subscriptions, because I think you need to take those into consideration. If you really need to work off some of that energy right away, hit the like button down below or subscribe to the channel for more. So one of the common objections to subscription pricing is that it requires you to keep paying continuously, and you get the new versions of the software whether you really want it or not. Maybe it's got features you don't actually care about. Well, with a subscription, you've got to pay for it regardless. And so in the old model, not everybody who used Photoshop or Lightroom would pay for every upgrade. You could skip one if you wanted. So I think it's worth looking at an alternate variation where, let's say you upgraded every other release, right? So you would have skipped a full half of them. What happens if we take out half of the upgrade fees? Where does that math end up? Well, if we take that out and buy Photoshop and pay for 4 upgrades instead of 8, and then we buy Lightroom and then we only pay for 3 upgrades instead of 6, that still puts our total expenses at $1,881. And I'll bring back the subscription number again for comparison, $1,378.62. So over $500 in savings by going with the subscription. And that's if you'd skipped out on half of the upgrades. So even in this scenario, the numbers just don't work out to use price as an argument against the subscription. It's not even close. I mean, that's over $500. That's a new camera. One last caveat with subscription software, though, is that it requires the software company to keep making new features and enhancements to the software, right? If I'm going to keep paying every month, they need to hold up their end of the bargain. There's no sense. I don't want to keep paying if I'm not getting new features, if I'm not getting support for new cameras, if I'm not getting enhancements to existing features, if I'm not getting entirely new things that I couldn't do before. So then we have to ask, has Adobe done that, or have they kind of been slacking? Well, turns out I've actually explored that topic in another video that you can check out right here or from the link below.